Cool. Well, since my name is in the title, I guess I can kick things off and lob it up to you guys actually to maybe introduce yourself, just kind of give it a little brief background on who you are and what you're doing. So Lauren, why don't you start with this?
Hi, I'm Lauren. I work with Giveth and the TEC, and at Giveth I do mostly communications, and the TEC I'm a steward, and we're really actively involved in governance in all of those DAOs, so I'm happy to be here.
Hi everyone, I'm Tyler. I've been around DAO Masters since it started. We're really focused on kind of putting together the organizational best practices for DAOs. There right now, I kind of help with our leadership team and then also run our research division. So do you have issues within your organization and the DAO in general? We're happy to chat and talk about that. And if you haven't figured it out, come tell us how to do it right.
Cool. My name is Chris Powers. I work on governance at DXDAO. DXDAO is a fully on-chain organization that is approaching its three-year anniversary. We manage a couple different DeFi products, and we distinguish ourselves from most other DAOs because we use non-reportable, reputation-based governance, token-based governance. So I think the title of this, I guess, is Rock the Vote, right? Which I think was like a cool campaign in like the 90s. I remember Puff Daddy like hosting some concerts about voting, and like that's important. I think better governance, I guess, is a little bit more appealing to me. I don't know if we can really define what better governance is, but it's kind of like a way that we're kind of like moving towards there. So maybe like if we just kind of start with maybe from like a systems perspective of like how you think someone that's going about wanting to institute quote unquote good governance should go about that in designing, say, like their structure or initial voting system. And so Lauren, why don't we start with you and then we'll go to Tyler.
Sure, yeah. Well, something I really like is something we've been doing at the Token Engineering Commons, which is collaborative DAO design. Basically, we did something called collaborative economics, where I really think it's the best way of going about things. Instead of just having like a one-size-fits-all solution, we involved the community and educated them all about all the different parameters, the way that they're going to affect the community, and we ended up designing our governance system and a bonding curve with community input. And we did it in like an iterative processing. And so we had we had these parties where we got people to come in and people who knew a little bit more about the systems that were being proposed, the different parameters being proposed, could explain to other people how to use them. And we had this whole dashboard, and then basically anybody who's involved in the community could start putting forward proposals for the DAO using this dashboard and coming to these parties. And then we had these debates where people were communicating with each other and debating different parameters. And we basically built the entire system from the ground up. And it started with like an entire year of cultural build of like working together as a community, understanding what our values are, defining the mission, the vision, the values.
I think that, like we can like almost call that, it's like the life stew, right? It's like the stew that creates life that like exists before. You're not really sure what these ingredients are or what's going to happen, but then like a bolt of lightning happens, or then like kind of things form and kind of do that. So Tyler, I guess like what are some initial design structures or systems for like maybe that, like what would be that goo that makes up that like, initial creation of life?
Yeah, for us, it's been interesting at DAO Masters. We're a relatively small team, probably about 30 to 40 core contributors. And what's been interesting, for anyone who's starting a DAO or new in the DAO there, our governance has been pretty laissez-faire, I'd almost say, where it's more about almost coalition building and going out and those real core contributors spending time in the community and just getting a sense of where people are at in one-on-one conversations, in spending time just in the Discord. And whenever we've put things up to a vote, I think in the early stages, we've almost always known that, the community is behind this. And so it's been interesting to look at the governance at the early stage and see it almost as this coalition building process. How can we go out and get everyone jazzed about, this general direction that we might be going? And then, as we've been growing, we've been thinking more and more, Hirsch in the audience is redoing our tokenomics right now, and we're starting to think about these things like the reputation and decoupling that from the financial token, because I think ultimately we have relatively strong opinions that those things should be decoupled. And then it comes back to a question of, I think, employing a process similar to what you all said, Lauren, of this almost emergent governance process. Where do people want to be, spending time putting their vote? How are we going to think about doing that? So we're in the very earliest stages of that. And I'll stop there. I have stronger opinions about it.
No, I think we've got like some room to run here with this. Yeah, because it's like Ethereum DAOs, like we did not invent public goods or like governance of them. On-chain management of them is a like new evolution, but there were ways of managing public goods. I think a lot about like managing open source and like the governance around open source, right? Open source software has been around for a long time, and the way that is iterated upon and governed like has been predates like the blockchain land. And really, what's happening, I guess, with this on-chain governance is we're actually formalizing some of that governance around those communities. And so I guess it kind of creates this tension, though, between like creating formal structures for governance that like create accountability, transparency, and like all of these things that are good that we want to have for these public goods that can grow and we want to see foster. But at the same time, like, does that like stymie growth, innovation, or kind of like, whatever we were actually talking backstage before this, we think of open source management and governance, you think a lot about like the benevolent dictator, right? And so like, is there a room for the benevolent dictator in DAO governance? And so Tyler, since we were chatting about this, like, what do you think about, benevolent dictators in DAO governance?
Yeah, it's interesting. Trying to look at some of the case studies as to what's out there. I was telling Chris, if you look at Ethereum, Vitalik had his initial vision for it, and then, recently comes out with Ethereum in-game, and that's quite different than what that initial plan was 5 years ago. And yet you see the community totally galvanize behind it and say, this is absolutely where we want to be going. If we try and think of a counterfactual or an alternative, it would be like the most opposite thing we could do would say, hey, community, everyone submit their proposal for where we think Ethereum should go, and then somehow we're going to have a sense-making process as to how to get there. Both are valid ways to do things, but as like when Vitalik comes out and says, hey, like we're going here, the benefit of that is you can move faster, and it kind of puts in those guide rails. And to me, that's something that is very beneficial for DAOs because it lets them move faster, right? When you know where you're going, then all of a sudden it's easier to design some of those governance mechanisms to say, we now have these core objectives. And so what do we need? Like, what governance now makes sense to put in place to make sure we hit those core objectives? And I think that's something that's been interesting to watch and see. And even at DAO Masters, we struggle with this. How much should the sort of core leaders be setting the vision and stuff versus how much do we need to rely on the community to pull that up? And I think it's an open question, and I don't think there's one right answer, but I do think there are clear benefits to that kind of benevolent dictator type of governance.
Right.
Yeah, I would love to add to that. I think, for me, when I think of the benevolent dictator, it's often the benevolent role. So it's somebody who maybe has expertise in the field. And I don't think that it's best to have people with expertise in the field to make the decisions ultimately, but I really like the advice process. So it's like including the opinions of experts in the field and people who are affected by the decisions, and then like bringing those things together and then informing the community. And it's like, and having all of this transparent as well. So like the people in the benevolent dictator roles can also have opinions, and then their influence might sway people one way or another. And maybe because they actually have expertise in the field, and maybe because they actually have a good idea of how things should go, but then people actually are able to make up their own minds. And then I think that this comes down to like then how we capture the voting process. So it's like we could have something that something that I get frustrated with in voting is when like it's not really anonymous. It's like you're voting with your ETH address, and it shows like people know it's me. You can just find out it's me. So then that actually prohibits me from voting in the way that I want to. So I think like having anonymous voting, and then also having it so that you don't see like real-time results. So you don't know how the benevolent dictator voted finally, and you also are able to vote anonymously. And then it's like we can actually capture community perspective with including the opinions of experts in the field. And I think that that's like really.
Yeah, and I think kind of what I'm hearing is like it's almost like decoupling all of the different functions that maybe like the benevolent dictator did, but like, okay, you can still like provide the vision, but in terms of like the decision and implementation, like that can actually go through like a different system. And I think that's what like having these on-chain structures, you can actually like, peel back those different functions. To kind of switch a little bit on a different topic, but related, I think for any blockchains, one of the first things that a blockchain is trying to protect against is like a Sybil attack or like a spam attack. And I think for governance systems, perhaps it's not at the level of like a Sybil attack, but you very quickly do realize that one of the most important things in terms of a governance system and a governance culture is how do you manage the attention of voters, or like the fatigue, or people call voter fatigue. And I think deciding like what is a proposal, or even the idea that like, is everything that is voted upon like created equally? And so maybe like, how do you think about like what you would define as like quote unquote governance decisions from a community? And like, how should you delineate between those decisions on some that are maybe like very large or some that are like small? And like, where do you kind of like, how do you direct those to them? So like, Lauren, you want to start us off with?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we need to just have different systems for different types of votes, really. Like there's like, I was reading like some of the questions that were proposed by people, and I was reading the panel description, and one of the questions was like, which votes should be on-chain and which votes should be off-chain. There are also a lot of questions about like, what's the ideal quorum? And I think that like all of these things, like you need to consider like what you're actually voting on. Are people voting on controlling the treasury, or are they voting on like whether or not we should change what we call ourselves from giveathers to unicorns.
Change the mascot. I was going to say change the mascot.
It's like some things are more important and critical than other things. And so I think that like the parameters which we use to control those votes like can be adjusted based on the votes. And then we can create like modular systems on an as needed basis. So it's like you start out with like this kind of decision-making process. And then as you're going through the process of being a DAO and making decisions, then you can add like layers on top of that, like new voting structures as new problems arise.
Yeah, although I do think maybe the mascot change might get more voter engagement and discussion
really
than the treasury movement.
It was really contentious.
Tyler, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I guess my thoughts on this are a lot around who does it affect? You kind of ask like when do we vote, or what should a proposal be? And if I'm thinking about like what needs to be an on-chain proposal, then to me that needs to have an impact on the majority of the DAO. Right, I don't think I need an on-chain vote necessarily for should we have a research meeting at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock, right? Like that very simplistic example, right? But then when it gets down to we're talking about should we change the bonding curve on Uniswap? Like that becomes all of a sudden this is very important. Everyone should know. And then my other opinion there is that there should be it's good to have very measurable or clear outcomes on the things you're voting on, right? I think it needs to be that very clear, like yes or no, or A, B, and C. I think a lot of DAOs get caught up in, we need to be decentralized, and so we need to have these votes on everything. And at a certain point, like you can't set a strategy with a vote, right? We can put up 3 different strategies and then say, which one do you all think we should execute? And then that ultimately can be a vote. But I think thinking about, what needs to go out there and actually be like discussed in advance before we actually put it on chain to vote on is actually pretty important when you think about that whole governance process.
Yeah, and just to give some DXDAO perspective here. So I think if you add up mainnet, Gnosis Chain, and Arbitrum, I think we've passed something like 1,300 proposals since inception. So we actually take kind of almost the opposite view of this, which is more of like lots of things on proposals. So like every worker proposal is a proposal. We make like signal proposals on these things. And one of the things, like there's kind of 2 reasons that we're able to do that. One is our consensus mechanism of holographic consensus is also like a quorum management tool. So anyone can submit a proposal, But to get a proposal into the boosted phase where it doesn't need a majority to pass, there's like a mini prediction market or a staking period where people are betting on whether or not that proposal should go up there. So that's the way you kind of manage the spam element to that. And the second reason is we are very okay with like what people might like call low voter participation. Like I love when I see certain like team members have their worker proposal and like I see the people vote for it and it's like they're other team members, right? And like I actually maybe haven't worked with them, but like I'm glad that proposal is passing. I don't need to vote on that, but it like kind of there's a certain level like of transparency to the DAO and to the community, and I think it allows like kind of in a little bit of a contrast you're talking about like who like people not wanting to know who is voting, where like with this method it's the people that are voting for this proposal that kind of give it its legitimacy, because maybe those are people that are like well known in the community or something.
Yeah, one thing I'd love to pose to you two, since you're all part of these much larger DAOs, I think at the early stages, you want to say yes to everything and you don't want to discourage people by voting down their proposals. And so I think that's probably a large reason why we don't send so many things to a proposal, is because our contributors, I think, as everyone knows, are the most important part of your DAO. And so you want to create a culture where you can feel like you can say yes or no. So to your Anon point, but I'd be curious to hear from your all's experience, how have you created that culture where you can, vote yes or no and people are okay with that and want to stick around, or is it a feature that when you say no, they want to leave and that's kind of what you want?
Yeah. I just say it's really tough, and I would say the first proposal from most DAO contributors is probably like their most anxious moment since like middle school. Like just like I'm putting this on chain, I'm putting myself like out in front of people. This is what I'm going to work on, and then people are going to vote for it. So like that itself is kind of like a big jump that people like want to make sure they have everything set up before they like go to that level. Of course, we have like a wonderful Contributor X team that helps people through that process, so it's no longer intimidating for people to onboard to DAO.
I think something that really helps for me personally is like having clear criteria. So it's like we have I've been working with our communications team on creating like really good documentation. So it's kind of like we have our covenant and we have like our code of conduct, and like the things, like the proposals that are being put forward need to first agree to that. So then it's easy to vote no on something that's going against like what we agreed as a community is like the way that we define ourselves. And then I think then we also have the advice process, which is also in our documentation, and it explains that proposals need to be on our forum and need to like generate comments for a period of at least 5 days before they can even go towards the DAO. And so it's like there's already like this stringent criteria. It's like, okay, these are like clear no things. And then in the advice process, it's like once something goes up on the forum, it's an opportunity for anyone in the community who's getting involved or who cares about that decision to make comments, and then the proposer is able to respond to those comments as well. And so I think it's like having this open communication and also having like really clear boundaries around like what's acceptable for the DAO and what's not acceptable for the DAO makes it really easy for me to vote. And then I think this then the last stage of sometimes I still want to vote no, and then I feel uncomfortable because I don't want to be like the naysayer. But then I think it really just takes having a culture where it's also okay to say no respectfully, and it's also okay to disagree with something and then communicate about it and then like work together. And I think that like that's something we're really focused on building. So I think then like having the cultural care is like another element of ensuring that like good proposals go through, and then proposals that aren't good for the DAO don't go through. And yeah.
Just to underscore the comment about the forum, because we haven't mentioned that yet, and I think like forums are so terribly important to DAOs and like kind of how they should be governed, and things that happen before the proposal process, as you were saying. So just because we only have a couple minutes here, just to kind of close out, I wanted to talk, just kind of throw out maybe a contentious topic or people just have like lots of opinions on, but one of the ways that I guess that people think about like streamlining DAOs efficiencies and operations is through some type of like delegation. So I don't know, like either like if you guys are very pro delegation or very against delegation, but maybe what are some like areas where you think like delegation could be helpful, and where could it be harmful for you guys in your communities?
Well, I think this comes into the conversation about quorum, and it's like it was really interesting listening to Eric, and he was saying they set their minimum quorum too high and they could never reach their minimum quorum, and that just like really messed things up. So I think that this is really interesting, and like where delegation comes into play is like then community members who are not as active, but then they have trusted other community members they can delegate, and then those delegates can vote for them. But I think like another really good process is like being able to like check up on your delegates. And we have this like one voting process in the Token Engineering Commons where there's like a delegate voting period, and then there's a period after where the vote is still open that like delegates can't vote anymore, but then people can check on their delegates' votes. And then if they don't like it, they can say no. So if like other active community members like really want to jump in and check on their delegates, they can. And I think that like the delegation really helps to ensure that you're getting like enough voter engagement, and then having the ability for community members to keep their delegates in check is like another necessary step.
Yeah, not too many strong opinions, and we have 30 seconds left. And the way I almost think about delegation is from an organizational structure standpoint and less from the voting standpoint. And so, like, if you look at kind of what Yearn does with their governance model, where they have these individual teams that are each in charge, I feel to me that's almost a way of saying, look, like, as a part of Yearn, I agree that this team is best suited to make a decision here. And so I'm going to agree with whatever outcome that they choose. And so that to me is just another way to think about delegation rather than assigning it to someone, is we can actually do it at the organizational structure level and say, we're going to almost elect or come up with these teams. And then based off that, we're going to agree with the decisions they come up with. And that's more of a softer delegation than like, here's my votes. As you do with, an ENS or something like that.
Cool. Well, thanks, guys. This was a lot of fun. I think that's it. So maybe let's get a round of applause and we'll head off.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.